In the spring of 1945, on a small island at the edge of Japan, the Second World War reached its most brutal form. Beneath rain-soaked hills and shattered villages, soldiers and civilians alike were drawn into a battle where surrender was rare, survival uncertain, and victory measured only by endurance. What unfolded on Okinawa would change how the war ended and how its final decisions were made. By early 1945, the Pacific War had reached a critical stage. Allied forces had pushed steadily westward across the ocean, capturing island after island and closing in on the Japanese home islands. Each advance brought heavier resistance and higher casualties. Okinawa now stood as the final barrier, a strategic stepping stone less than 400 miles from Japan itself. For the Allies, Okinawa was essential. Its airfields and harbors would support an eventual invasion of the Japanese mainland. From here, bombers could strike deeper into Japan, and naval forces could operate with greater reach. For Japan, the island represented the last opportunity to inflict such devastating losses that the enemy might hesitate before attempting invasion. Japanese commanders prepared for the defense of Okinawa with a cold and deliberate understanding of their situation. They knew that the island could not be held in the traditional sense. Naval power had been lost. Air superiority belonged to the enemy. Any attempt to stop the landings at the beaches would only result in rapid destruction under overwhelming fire. Instead of meeting the invasion at the shoreline, Japanese leadership adopted a strategy designed for endurance rather than victory. Okinawa was transformed into a fortress beneath the surface of the island. Rather than constructing visible fortifications that could be identified and destroyed from the air or sea, defenders built an extensive underground system that blended into the natural terrain. Caves that had existed for centuries were expanded and reinforced. New tunnels were carved deep into limestone ridges. Bunkers were concealed within hillsides, connected by passageways that allowed movement without exposure to enemy fire. This underground network stretched across the southern half of the island, where the terrain offered the greatest defensive advantages. Ridges, hills, and escarpments were selected not for their appearance, but for their ability to absorb punishment and conceal defenders. Artillery positions were embedded within rock. Machine gun nests were hidden behind narrow firing, slits that revealed nothing until they opened fire. Observation posts were placed high within caves, allowing defenders to track enemy movement while remaining invisible. The purpose of this system was not to repel the invasion outright. Japanese commanders understood that Allied forces would land in overwhelming numbers, supported by naval gunfire and air power beyond anything Japan could counter. The goal was instead to force the attackers into a slow and costly advance. Every yard of ground would be contested. Every position would require time, manpower, and sacrifice to overcome. By avoiding beach defenses, Japanese forces denied the enemy a clear and decisive victory at the outset. The initial landings were allowed to proceed with minimal resistance, creating a false sense of success. Only when Allied troops moved inland did the true battle begin. As soldiers advanced, they encountered a defense that appeared suddenly and from unexpected directions. Fire erupted from hillsides that had seemed lifeless moments before. Attacks came from the front, the flanks, and even from behind as defenders emerged from hidden exits. The underground system allowed Japanese units to survive bombardment that would have destroyed surface positions. Naval shells and aerial bombs tore apart the landscape, yet defenders sheltered deep within the earth. When the barrage ended, they emerged to fight again. This cycle repeated itself day after day, frustrating attackers and draining their strength. Hills that had been pounded for hours still had to be assaulted by infantry at close range. Each defensive position was designed to support others nearby. Fields of fire overlapped. Retreat routes were protected. Units could withdraw into tunnels. When threatened, then reappear at new firing points. This flexibility allowed relatively small numbers of defenders to hold back much larger forces. Even when a position was overrun, resistance often continued from within the caves beneath it. The southern defenses were organized into successive lines, each anchored on natural terrain. When one line fell, defenders pulled back to the next, forcing the enemy to repeat the same brutal process. Progress became agonizingly slow. Advances measured in yards came at the cost of lives. The battle turned into a grinding contest of endurance, exactly as Japanese commanders had intended. This approach also shaped the psychological dimension of the battle. For Allied troops, the enemy was rarely visible. Combat lacked clear front lines. Danger seemed constant and unpredictable. A quiet hillside could erupt in gunfire without warning. Casualties occurred even in areas believed to be secure. The stress of fighting an unseen enemy wore heavily on morale and concentration. Japanese defenders, meanwhile, fought with the knowledge that retreat offered no escape. Supplies were limited. Reinforcements were scarce. Orders emphasized resistance. To the end, the underground fortress was not only a defensive system, but a final refuge. Many positions became tombs for those who held them, sealed by collapse or destroyed by assault. The strategy reflected a broader shift in Japanese military thinking during the final months of the war. Victory through maneuver was no longer possible. Instead, the goal became to impose such severe losses that the enemy would reconsider further advances. Okinawa was intended to serve as a warning, a demonstration of the cost of invading territory close to Japan itself. This defensive philosophy extended beyond military considerations. Civilians were drawn into the underground world as well. Many sought shelter in caves that also served as military positions. The distinction between battlefield and refuge disappeared. As fighting intensified, these spaces became scenes of profound human suffering. Caught between opposing forces and relentless bombardment, the transformation of Okinawa into a fortress beneath the ground defined the character of the battle. It ensured that victory would not come quickly or easily. It turned the campaign into one of the longest and bloodiest struggles of the Pacific War. The defenses did not stop the invasion, but they achieved their intended purpose. They slowed the advance, inflicted heavy losses, and forced the enemy to confront the true cost of victory. In the end, the underground fortress could not change the outcome. Superior numbers, firepower, and resources prevailed. Yet the strategy succeeded in shaping how the battle was fought and how it would be remembered. Okinawa became a symbol of attrition, of endurance pushed to its limits, and of a defense designed not for survival, but for sacrifice. The caves, tunnels, and ridgelines of southern Okinawa stand as a reminder of that choice. Beneath the surface of the island, an entire army prepared not to win, but to endure long enough to make victory unbearably expensive. When Allied forces came ashore in April, the landings unfolded with an unexpected quiet. The beaches were taken with relative ease, and resistance appeared scattered and disorganized. For many soldiers, the absence of heavy fire created a sense of cautious optimism. Compared to earlier island assaults, Okinawa seemed strangely calm. The sea was secure, the shoreline was gained, the first objectives were reached with minimal loss. Yet this calm concealed a far more dangerous reality. The lack of resistance was not a sign of weakness, but a deliberate decision. Japanese defenders had withdrawn from the coast, abandoning the beaches to the invaders. They waited inland, hidden within the hills and ridgelines that dominated the southern half of the island. As Allied units advanced beyond the landing zones, the illusion of victory quickly dissolved. The true nature of the defense revealed itself without warning. Fire erupted suddenly from positions that had appeared empty only moments before. Japanese forces emerged from concealed caves and tunnels, striking with precision and coordination. Attacks came from the front, the sides, and the rear. Then, just as quickly, the defenders vanished back into the earth, leaving behind confusion and casualties. Every hill became a stronghold. What seemed like an ordinary rise in the terrain often concealed artillery pieces dug deep into rock. Machine gun positions were hidden behind narrow openings, impossible to detect until they opened fire. Mortar crews operated from underground. Chambers, adjusting their aim through observation posts hidden high within ridges. The landscape itself had been weaponized. As troops pushed farther inland, movement grew increasingly difficult. The terrain favored the defender at every turn. Steep slopes forced attackers to advance uphill under fire. Dense vegetation limited visibility and made coordination difficult. Narrow approaches funneled units into kill zones where defenders had already calculated fields of fire. There were few open spaces, and each step forward carried the risk of sudden ambush. The weather compounded these challenges. Seasonal rains arrived and transformed the battlefield into a quagmire. Roads dissolved into thick mud. Vehicles became stuck. Artillery pieces sank into the ground. Soldiers struggled to move even short distances while carrying heavy equipment. Progress slowed to a crawl, and exhaustion set in quickly. Supplying the front became a constant struggle. Ammunition, food, and medical supplies had to be carried. Forward by hand through mud and under fire, pack animals faltered. Vehicles could not reach forward units. When supplies did arrive, they were often insufficient. Units fought for days with limited resources, unsure when relief would come. The evacuation of the wounded was especially difficult. Stretcher teams moved slowly across exposed ground, often under direct fire. Many wounded soldiers lay where they fell, waiting hours for help. Medics worked under extreme pressure, tending injuries in shallow foxholes or behind makeshift cover. The sound of battle never ceased, and safety was never assured. Combat on Okinawa became close and relentless. Engagements were fought at short range, often within yards. Caves had to be cleared one by one. Each position required careful coordination between infantry, artillery, and supporting fire. Even after a hill was taken, defenders frequently emerged. From hidden passages to counterattack or continue firing from below. There were no clear front lines. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. A position secured in the morning could become contested again by afternoon. Units rotated forward and back, But rest was brief and incomplete. The constant tension wore down even the most experienced soldiers. Sleep came in short, uneasy moments. The sound of artillery and small arms fire became the background of daily existence. That Japanese defenders exploited every advantage the terrain offered. Their intimate knowledge of the land allowed them to move unseen. Tunnel networks enabled them to shift forces without exposure. A position that appeared destroyed could suddenly become active again. This unpredictability deepened the strain on attacking troops and slowed the advance. Further, as days turned into weeks, the cost of each gain became apparent. Casualties mounted steadily. Commanders faced the difficult balance between pressing forward and preserving their forces. Progress was measured in yards rather than miles. Victory was no longer defined by rapid movement, but by the ability to endure. The deceptive calm of the initial landings had given way to one of the most punishing battles of the war. Okinawa was not a swift assault, but a grinding test of strength and will. The defenders had succeeded in drawing the enemy into the terrain of their choosing, where every advantage belonged to those who waited underground. In these hills and ridges, the battle revealed its true character. It was not a contest of speed, but of endurance. Not a clash of sweeping maneuvers, but a relentless struggle fought step by step. Okinawa became a battlefield where survival depended on patience, resilience, and the ability to endure conditions as deadly as the enemy itself. In the south of Okinawa, the fighting grew steadily more brutal with each passing day. What had begun as a difficult advance hardened into a relentless struggle against some of the most formidable defensive positions encountered in the Pacific War. American forces found themselves confronting an enemy that refused to yield ground easily. Entrenched within a landscape that had been deliberately shaped for prolonged resistance, every advance required the reduction of fortified positions one by one. Hills, ridges, and rocky outcrops that appeared insignificant on maps revealed themselves as carefully prepared strongholds. Each was reinforced with underground chambers, firing ports, and concealed exits. Before any assault could begin, artillery and naval gunfire were brought to bear. Hillsides were blasted repeatedly, torn apart by shellfire that reshaped the terrain and filled the air with dust and smoke. Yet even after hours of bombardment, the defenders often survived. Deep underground, Japanese troops waited out the storm of explosives, protected by layers of rock and earth. When the firing lifted, they emerged to fight once more. Positions thought to be destroyed suddenly came alive with rifle fire, grenades, and machine guns. The cycle repeated itself day after day, exhausting attackers and testing their resolve. Infantry assaults followed the bombardments, and these were among the most dangerous tasks of the campaign. Soldiers advanced uphill under fire, carrying heavy equipment through mud and shattered ground. Caves had to be approached carefully, knowing that defenders inside were prepared to fight to the end. Grenades were thrown into dark openings. Flamethrowers were used to force defenders out or seal positions permanently. Each assault carried devastating risk, and casualties were often severe. Clearing a single hill could take days. Once taken, it had to be held against counterattacks from unseen tunnels and hidden routes. Progress across the southern defenses was agonizingly slow. Gains were measured not in miles, but in yards earned at great cost. Fatigue set in quickly, and units were worn down by constant exposure to danger, noise, and loss. while the struggle on land intensified. The battle expanded far beyond the shoreline. At sea, control of the waters surrounding Okinawa became a desperate contest of endurance and sacrifice. Japan committed its remaining air strength to a campaign unlike any seen before. Suicide attacks were launched on a massive scale, intended to inflict maximum damage on the Allied fleet. Wave after wave of aircraft descended on ships positioned around the island. Pilots aimed directly for flight decks, bridges, and ammunition stores. The attacks came suddenly and with terrifying speed. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky, but many aircraft broke through. Destroyers were struck. Carriers were hit. Explosions tore through steel hulls as fires erupted across decks. Crews fought desperately to save their ships. Damage control teams worked amid smoke, flames, and falling debris. Ammunition was jettisoned to prevent secondary explosions. Wounded sailors were carried below decks as the threat of further attacks loomed overhead. For hours at a time, there was no rest, only the expectation that another aircraft might appear at any moment. Losses at sea mounted steadily. Ships were sunk or crippled. Others were forced to withdraw for repairs. Even when vessels survived, the psychological toll on crews was immense. The knowledge that an attacker intended to die in the act of striking created a constant sense of tension. Sleep was brief and uneasy. Every alarm sent hearts racing, unsure whether the next attack would be survivable. The Kamikaze campaign represented Japan's final attempt to counter Allied naval superiority. It inflicted serious damage and caused heavy casualties, but it could not change the overall balance of power. The fleet remained in place. Supplies continued to flow. Air support for ground operations was maintained despite the losses. Together, the land and sea battles formed a single, unbroken struggle. On shore, infantry fought for every yard against defenders hidden in rock and earth. At sea, sailors endured relentless attacks designed to break their will. Both fronts demanded constant sacrifice, and both revealed the extreme lengths to which the defenders were willing to go. In the south of Okinawa, the battle became a test of endurance unmatched in the Pacific War. Firepower alone could not secure victory. Progress required persistence, coordination, and an acceptance of terrible cost. The hills were taken one by one, not through speed or maneuver, but through sustained pressure and determination. As the campaign continued, it became clear that Okinawa was not simply another objective. It was a warning. The ferocity of the fighting on land and at sea offered a glimpse of what an invasion of Japan itself might entail. In these shattered hills and burning waters, the final phase of the war revealed its true and devastating character. The civilian population of Okinawa suffered terribly. Caught between opposing forces, many were forced from their homes or driven into caves that soon became battlegrounds. Food supplies vanished. Disease spread. Fear dominated daily life. The battle blurred the line between combatant and civilian in ways rarely seen before. As the weeks passed, Japanese resistance on Okinawa remained fierce, despite losses that grew heavier with each passing day. The battle entered a phase defined not by maneuver or surprise, but by endurance pushed to its limits. Orders continued to emphasize fighting to the death rather than surrender, reflecting a command philosophy that valued sacrifice above survival. This directive shaped every engagement. Defensive positions were held until they were physically destroyed. Withdrawal was rare. Surrender was almost non-existent. Entire units were wiped out where they stood. Some were buried alive as caves collapsed under bombardment. Others fought until ammunition was exhausted, continuing with grenades, rifles, and even improvised weapons. When positions finally fell, they often revealed only silence and devastation. The ground itself bore the marks of prolonged resistance, scarred by shell craters, shattered rock, and collapsed tunnel entrances that sealed the fate of those inside. Leadership. Losses steadily undermined Japanese coordination. Officers and non-commissioned leaders were killed at rates that crippled organized command and control. Communications broke down. Planned counterattacks failed to materialize. Yet the collapse of formal leadership did not bring an end to resistance. Instead, the nature of the fighting shifted. Small groups and individual soldiers continued to operate independently, guided by standing orders and personal resolve rather than direct command. These isolated defenders exploited the underground network that still crisscrossed the battlefield. From concealed entrances, they emerged without warning to strike advancing troops. Rifle fire, grenades, and sudden charges erupted from terrain thought to be secure. After brief engagements, the defenders vanished again into caves and tunnels, leaving behind casualties and uncertainty. This pattern repeated itself across the battlefield, reinforcing the sense that resistance was endless. For Allied troops, the enemy seemed to exist everywhere and nowhere at once. There were no stable front lines, no clear sense of progress that could be easily measured or trusted. A ridge secured at great cost one day could become contested again. The next, a stretch of ground cleared by daylight might conceal defenders who reappeared under cover of darkness. The battlefield defied predictability, demanding constant vigilance. This uncertainty imposed a heavy psychological burden. Soldiers learned to distrust silence, knowing it could conceal danger. Every movement forward carried the risk of sudden attack. Even moments of rest were marked by tension, as the threat of hidden resistance never fully receded. The constant pressure eroded confidence and replaced it with cautious endurance. As the fighting dragged on, the cost of the battle rose steadily and relentlessly. Casualties mounted to staggering levels on both sides. Losses were not confined to infantry alone. Engineers clearing obstacles, medics evacuating the wounded, artillery crews supporting assaults, and supply personnel moving forward all came under fire. No role was safe from the dangers of the battlefield. Veteran units that had endured earlier. Campaigns now faced conditions that tested the limits of their experience. Fatigue accumulated day after day. Sleep was irregular and brief. Exposure to heat, rain, mud, and constant noise wore down physical strength. Equipment failed under harsh conditions, weapons clogged, boots disintegrated. But ease weakened even as demands increased. Replacements arrived to fill depleted ranks, often lacking the experience needed for such an unforgiving environment. Veterans were tasked with guiding newcomers through combat that offered little margin for error. The responsibility added to their burden, as each loss weighed heavily on those who remained. Bonds formed quickly under fire, and were just as quickly broken by casualties. Commanders faced constant pressure from all directions. Higher headquarters demanded progress, knowing that time mattered strategically and politically. Units on the Ground reported mounting losses and exhaustion. Every decision required balancing momentum against preservation of life. An aggressive assault might gain ground, but at unacceptable cost. A cautious approach might save lives, but allow defenders to regroup. This dilemma defined leadership throughout the later stages of the battle. Commanders adjusted tactics, relying on overwhelming firepower where possible, while attempting to limit exposure of infantry. Yet even the most carefully planned assaults carried risk. The underground defenses neutralized many advantages of superior firepower, forcing soldiers back into close combat, where danger was unavoidable. The psychological toll of the fighting deepened as the battle continued. Prolonged exposure to stress left many soldiers emotionally drained. Fear became constant rather than occasional. The need to remain alert at all times prevented meaningful rest. Even experienced troops found themselves struggling to maintain focus and morale. Witnessing repeated loss compounded the strain. Friends and comrades fell in attacks that gained only a few yards of ground. Medics worked tirelessly, often unable to save those they treated. The sight of wounded and dead became a daily reality. Over time, the cumulative effect of these experiences left lasting impressions that could not be easily erased. Despite these hardships, Allied forces continued to press forward. Endurance replaced speed as the measure of success. Units rotated. When possible, the relief was often brief and incomplete. The advance continued not because conditions improved, but because there was no alternative. Okinawa had to be secured, regardless of cost. For Japanese defenders, resistance persisted. Even as hope of victory vanished, isolated groups fought on without expectation of relief or escape. Their continued presence prolonged the battle and increased its toll, but could not alter its outcome. The struggle became one of principle and resolve rather than strategy. By this stage of the campaign, Okinawa had become more than a battlefield. It was a crucible that tested the limits of human endurance on both sides. The cost in lives, physical strength, and psychological resilience reached extraordinary levels. Each day added to the burden carried by those involved. The scars left by the fighting did not fade when the battle ended. For many who endured it, the experience of Okinawa remained vivid long afterward. The constant danger, the exhaustion, and the loss shaped memories that would last a lifetime. The battle stood as a testament to the human cost of prolonged warfare, revealing not only the price of victory, but the depth of suffering required to achieve it. By June, the character of the battle began to change. After weeks of relentless fighting, organized Japanese resistance across Okinawa started to collapse under the weight of sustained pressure, overwhelming firepower, and irreplaceable losses. What remained of the defending forces was no longer capable of coordinated defense across broad fronts. Instead, resistance fractured into shrinking pockets, isolated from one another and increasingly cut off from supplies, communication, and leadership. The southern part of the island became the final arena of this collapse. Japanese units that had once formed layered defensive lines were pushed steadily backward into confined areas defined by broken terrain and exhausted resources. Hills and ridges that had resisted assault for weeks were finally taken, not through sudden breakthroughs, but through the slow erosion of defensive strength. Each position fell only after prolonged struggle, leaving behind devastation rather than victory in any traditional sense. Remaining defenders fought on from caves and narrow valleys, often unaware of the broader situation beyond their immediate surroundings. With communications shattered, many units no longer knew whether neighboring positions still held or whether higher command even existed. Orders, when they arrived at all, were often outdated or impossible to execute. Yet resistance did not end abruptly. In many places, it continued out of discipline, habit, or a sense of obligation rather than any realistic hope of success. As pockets of resistance shrank, the fighting became increasingly localized and intense. Allied forces advanced cautiously, aware that even a small group of defenders could inflict casualties if overlooked. Clearing operations continued methodically. Caves were sealed. Isolated positions were reduced one by one. Each engagement carried risk. Even as the overall outcome became inevitable, the collapse of organized resistance did not bring immediate relief to those fighting on either side. Exhaustion defined this final phase of the battle. Allied units that had been engaged for weeks were physically and mentally depleted. Equipment was worn down. Supplies, though more reliable than earlier in the campaign, still had to be moved forward through damaged terrain. The pace of operations slowed, not from hesitation, but from the limits of human endurance. For Japanese defenders, conditions were even more severe. Food and water was scarce. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. Medical care was minimal or non-existent. Wounded soldiers often remained where they fell, unable to move and unlikely to receive treatment. Many defenders fought until their strength failed, driven by orders that left no alternative and circumstances that offered no escape. The end of the battle did not come with a dramatic moment of surrender or a decisive final assault. Instead, it arrived gradually, marked by silence, replacing gunfire in one sector after another. Resistance faded unevenly. In some areas, fighting ceased as remaining defenders were killed or incapacitated. In others, isolated individuals continued to resist long after organized combat had ended. Across the island, the effects of the campaign were unmistakable. Okinawa had been transformed by months of bombardment and ground combat. Villages lay in ruins. Fields were churned into mud and cratered earth. Hillsides were stripped of vegetation, their outlines altered by explosions. Roads were barely recognizable. The natural landscape bore the scars of sustained warfare at an unprecedented scale. Civilian suffering was woven deeply into this devastation. Communities had been displaced, destroyed, or caught between opposing forces. Survivors emerged from shelters to find homes gone and livelihoods erased. The human cost extended far beyond the battlefield, leaving lasting consequences for the island and its people. For Allied forces, securing Okinawa came at an immense price. Casualties numbered in the tens of thousands, including those killed, wounded, and incapacitated by exhaustion or illness. Medical facilities were overwhelmed. Units required extensive reorganization and rest before they could be considered combat effective again. Victory brought no sense of triumph, only relief that the ordeal had ended. Commanders assessed the outcome with sobering clarity. Okinawa had been taken, but it had demanded extraordinary sacrifice. The battle demonstrated the effectiveness of deeply entrenched defense and the limits of even overwhelming firepower. It confirmed that future operations against territory closer to Japan would likely be even more costly. The absence of a decisive breakthrough underscored this reality. Okinawa did not fall because one line was shattered or one maneuver succeeded. It fell because defenders were slowly worn down until resistance could no longer be sustained. The battle ended through exhaustion on both sides, with devastation spread across the island as its final legacy. In the aftermath, the meaning of Okinawa extended far beyond its strategic value. It became a measure of what total war had come to represent in its final stages. The scale of destruction, the duration of the fighting, and the depth of suffering forced a reckoning among those responsible for planning the next steps of the war. Okinawa was secured, but the cost was impossible to ignore. The battle left behind not only ruined terrain and shattered units, but a profound awareness of what lay ahead if the conflict continued along the same path. In this sense, Okinawa marked both an ending and a warning. It closed the final chapter of island warfare in the Pacific, while opening a far more difficult question about how the war itself would ultimately be brought to an end. The meaning of the battle extended far beyond the shores of Okinawa. What unfolded on the island was not simply the final major campaign of the Pacific War, but a grim revelation of what the future might hold. Okinawa offered Allied leaders a clear and unsettling preview of what an invasion of Japan itself could entail. The scale of resistance, the depth of preparation, and the willingness to fight to destruction exposed a reality that could no longer be ignored. The battle revealed a level of determination that surpassed even the fiercest fighting of earlier campaigns. Japanese defenders on Okinawa had fought not for tactical advantage or hope of victory, but out of obligation, ideology, and a belief that sacrifice itself held meaning. Entire formations had been destroyed without surrender. Isolated defenders continued to resist long after defeat was certain. This pattern of resistance suggested that any invasion of the Japanese home islands would face opposition of equal or greater intensity, multiplied across a far larger population and terrain. Civilians suffering on Okinawa added another dimension to this realization. The battle had drawn non-combatants directly into the conflict on a massive scale. Families were displaced, communities destroyed, and countless civilians killed or wounded. Many were caught between opposing forces with no means of escape. The distinction between battlefield and home had vanished. For Allied leaders, this raised profound moral and strategic questions. An invasion of Japan would not only pit armies against one another, but would inevitably engulf millions of civilians in violence and deprivation. The sheer cost of the battle weighed heavily on those responsible for shaping the next phase of the war. Okinawa had required enormous resources, sustained over months of combat. Casualties had reached staggering levels. Units were exhausted. Equipment was worn down. Medical systems were strained to their limits. Even with complete control of the air and sea, victory had come slowly and at immense human cost. These realities forced Allied planners to confront a terrible calculation. Victory through invasion was possible, but the price would be almost unimaginable. Okinawa suggested that the Japanese defense of their homeland would be even more desperate, even more uncompromising. The island was not Japan itself, yet it had been defended as if it were. There was little reason to believe the resistance would be less fierce closer to the heart of the nation. In the ruins of Okinawa, the final chapter of the war began to take shape. The battle demonstrated the extremes of modern warfare, where industrial-scale firepower met human resolve, hardened by ideology and circumstance. It showed how technology could devastate landscapes and cities, yet still fail to deliver quick victory against determined defenders. It also revealed the limits of human endurance, as soldiers and civilians alike were pushed beyond physical and psychological breaking points. The campaign stood as the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War, not only because of the numbers involved, but because of the manner in which it was fought. The prolonged struggle, the absence of decisive breakthroughs, and the relentless attrition marked a departure from earlier campaigns. Okinawa was not won through maneuver or surprise, but through sustained pressure that ground down resistance over time. It was a victory achieved through endurance rather than speed. This reality shaped how leaders viewed the future. Okinawa became a reference point in discussions about how the war might be ended. The battle demonstrated that continued conventional warfare would exact a toll that grew heavier with each engagement. It suggested that time itself had become an enemy, measured not only in strategic terms, but in lives lost and societies shattered. For those who fought on Okinawa, the meaning of the battle was deeply personal. Survivors carried memories of relentless combat, constant danger, and overwhelming loss. The experience reshaped their understanding of war and left scars that endured long after the guns fell silent. Okinawa became a symbol of what they had endured and what they had seen humanity inflict upon itself. For the world beyond the battlefield, Okinawa marked a turning point in awareness. It stripped away any remaining illusions about the nature of the conflict and its likely conclusion. The war had reached a stage where every option carried catastrophic consequences. Choices made in the aftermath of Okinawa would be shaped by the knowledge of what had occurred there, and by the desire to prevent an even greater catastrophe. On Okinawa, the road to Japan lay open. The island provided airfields, harbors, and a forward base unlike any previously captured. Militarily, the path forward was clear. Strategically and morally, it was anything but. The question that remained was not whether Japan could be reached, but how the war should be brought to an end. What Okinawa left behind was a reckoning. It forced leaders to weigh the value of victory against the cost required to achieve it. It confronted the world with the limits of endurance, both human and societal. The battle showed that the continuation of the war along existing lines would demand sacrifices on a scale that defied comprehension. In this sense, Okinawa was both an ending and a beginning. It closed the era of island campaigns that had defined the Pacific War. At the same time, it opened the most difficult and consequential chapter of all, one in which decisions would shape not only the outcome of the war, but the future of millions. The island stood silent in the aftermath, its landscape altered, its people scarred, its significance unmistakable. Okinawa had revealed the true cost of total war. What remained was the question of how much more the world was willing to endure before the conflict finally came to an end, and whether any price could be justified to bring that end closer.